Chapter 13. Thoreau had been accurate about the events following Runein's murder. Before the temple fire had turned to gray ash, it had been decreed that the earth was irrevocably contaminated, desecrated by Lasoni's survival and Runein's bloody fury. After a blessing in a nearby grove of trees, the soft earth was dug up and carried in baskets and slings to the temple. Buried past the top of the tallest standing stones, it would become Runein's unmarked grave, where her bones would rest forever. Once they appeased the gods, the elders sent both tribes on early migrations. Alone and gathered under the moon, the medicine keepers toiled. On the fresh earth, they sacrificed a deer, one of their symbols of purity. And in juxtaposition to the somber purification ritual, they spent the rest of the night getting drunk, stoned, and in as much trouble as possible. In the severe and somber light of morning, the cycle of carving new standing stones began. But after Lasone, the possibility of another rare desecration loomed in their minds and plans. They had learned from the follies of complacency and complexity. No, this new temple will be modest compared to the last. Fewer carvings of animals and events, more focus on the relationship between the stone's positions and the stars. The smaller temple would only take a few years to complete, but by then the crone would be buzzard food, along with many other perpetrators. The next generations of medicine keepers would barely remember why the first temple had been buried, only that a great evil had been secured beneath it, and that was enough. And then, one day, even the last temple's existence will be lost to time. Eventually, the Longlegs abandoned their nomadic lifestyle for the most part. They learned from their trash heaps how to selectively breed plants, and over time they applied similar methods to refining their water buffaloes, dogs, and other beasts. But Lasoni's people, the Spears, never saw the use of staying put, or becoming servants to the plants they ate, and season by season they would pay for their freedom with diminished numbers, starvation, and the harsh, unforgiving reality of life on the plains. And in this future epoch of forgetting, the secret of the black seed would also be lost. No matter, there were numerous other intoxicants. Fermented beverages won out over the less enjoyable, longer-lived herbs. Agriculture demanded daily care, early mornings, long days, predictable record-keeping, and rudimentary almanacs. The Longlegs, it seemed, were domesticating themselves along with their cattle and crops. But long before all these changes, Lasoni and Thoreau had finally reached their new home. That's not to say they didn't accumulate many scars and have many scares along the way. The distance had been impossibly long. Most would say fatally so for just two people. But they had the second sight of the herbs and just enough pity from the gods to survive. Other than the general directions they received at each encampment, the pair kept moving towards wherever the locals pointed and described as crazy, cursed, or magical. They were done with whatever passed for normal amongst most humans. They sought out their own kind, whoever that was. They eventually found an eclectic mix of people on a narrow coastal peninsula. The village was a melting pot, showcasing new shelter designs, clothing, or not, and foods, so many foods. Each family, couple, and individual had brought unique ways of living. Of course, some were downright crazy, but in a good way. Many were just like Lasoni and Thoreau, outcasts, mystics, medicine keepers, with a healthy sprinkling of lone wolf warriors for security. As Lasoni and Thoreau awkwardly built their first home and warmed to the locals, they began hearing every sort of incredulous story. Gathered around late-night fires, with pipes and mugs, animated faces spun far-out tales. They described crossing the perilous oceans on floating vessels, walking amongst giant trees many times taller than a mammoth, and a plethora of bizarre animals that all seemed made up. On the coast, trading was a regular event. Sometimes, Lawsone and Thoreau sat on the edge of the sea cliffs, watching boats and rafts cross from the great continent far in the distance. They loved speculating about its mysteries, and often planned their dream trip, which, according to Lawsone, always involved him doing most of the paddling. As far as expanding her herbal practice, Lawsone wallowed in a plant nirvana. She was always first amongst the other medicine keepers to shamelessly pester the sailors and merchants as they unloaded their boats. She found many analogues of her foundational herbs from far-flung places to her surprise and delight. Giant cacti limbs, shriveled but still alive from months at sea, took root in the rich soil. A wide variety of mushrooms, dried and crisp as straw, came to her from pole to pole. Having seen the pattern in nature, she fed a few extra caps to their livestock and yipped with joy the following year when hundreds came up in her garden. The engine driving all these changes in trade routes was stimulants. Apparently, getting work done topped forgetting your worries over a cup of grog, but only just. Lawsone found plenty of twig at the market, but also strange, flat green leaves, which reduced thirst and hunger while bolstering endurance. One of the oddest finds, various legumes that smelled fantastic, tasted terrible, but definitely popped her eyes open when chewed or boiled with the twig. Tragedies and traumas eventually struck, but now she was armed with a round flower of heavy eyes, which eased the pain of injuries, and the fan leaf plant that facilitated happiness, lust, and art, yet made splendid cloth and rope. Others in the village taught her new preservation methods, casks of salt brine, distilled alcohols, many kinds of vinegar, and so many honey varieties. Lawsone's reputation as a healer and spiritual guide spread far beyond the peninsula as her pharmacopoeia grew. However, it almost felt like she had too great a bounty with the passing years. More herbs than she could eat in a lifetime, and more navigation techniques and secrets that her mind could contain. If only she had more days. But time itself seemed shorter and shorter, or perhaps just faster and faster. More precious, for sure, as she and Thoreau traveled the path towards elder status. Amidst all this, though, a deep sorrow set in. The first few years, their passion and exploration of each other's flesh was such a bounty, so bonding. They never really thought of children. But as Lawsone assisted the midwives through her herbs, all the beautiful newborns began winding invisible clocks inside her. Learning more about her cycle and anatomy, Lawsone was shocked at how many times she could have conceived. Thoreau, bless him, had never said anything about it, despite wanting a son, or 12, to carry on his name. But once, cleaning their home, she found that old bundle of toxic red bark hidden away in a jar. She realized it must have been what damaged her insides. After spitting up blood in the temple, the first period she experienced on their journey was scarily heavy. She never told him, never felt the need to relive that chain of events. And, to be honest, she harbored the false fear that if Thoreau found out, he might leave her. So, to guard against that sorrow compounding, they found joy in the communal practice of child-rearing. Lawsone held and healed many babies, even some orphans. In a sense, she had many children, but more and more they looked nothing like her people. The features of the spears were disappearing into the long legs with each new coupling. That meant any baby more spear than long leg was exceedingly precious to her. Like a river, like time, like a falling stone, she realized that certain things only traveled one way. Her people were one of those things, and eventually they would all drift down the river of time and never return. Thoreau mostly spent his mornings away from Lawsone with the other men, hunting more massive prey and the occasional predator for the thrill of it. There were plenty of animals in the sea, but it was a lazy man's sport to a longleg like Thoreau. No, he needed to run, sweat, and sometimes wonder if he'd even make it back home. He was also sensitive to Lawsone's need for private moments. In sadness, ritual, sisterhood, and idle chit-chat with other villagers. Probably, mostly, about how stubborn men like him could be, and rightfully so. When the sun had passed its zenith, he usually reappeared in the village with stories, food, and embraces, settling into a leisurely evening with his love. Lasoni's inner voyages grew in complexity and intensity with the abundance of uninterrupted, daily navigation sessions in the still mornings. Her magical skills and self-knowledge fermented and matured. She had adopted many of the techniques from abroad, casting aside the ones that didn't serve her and refining the rest. However, along with increases in power and wisdom, something else accumulated in her psyche. A deep malaise, a foreboding, like volcanic smoke from a distant rumbling island. Unidentifiable, the sensation always made her chuckle in recognition, particularly when the herbs would bind her in time loops, or as she called it, sacred stitching. One lazy morning after a round of sex, Lasoni basked in the afterglow. Her words were sleepy and soft as she tried to once again describe the mechanics of her sacred stitching to Thoreau. "Like this," she said, running fingers over the smooth tapestry she had turned into a blanket. The needle and thread disappear under the surface, but come back around almost at the same spot, but still only one thread, connected forever. "Yes," he said, tracing circles on her back as she lay on her belly. "I feel it too, and I know it comes again, and will come after, and I laugh," he said, knowing that she knew, and that language falls short of such experiences. He set his lips to her, chuckling through kisses, as his fingers traveled down her lower back. His strong hand gave her ass a firm squeeze, producing a moan. Then, to tease her, he pulled away and tenderly exposed her neck from under a fountain of hair. Starting with a kiss behind her ear, he sucked and nibbled as he gently rolled her over, leaving a trail of smooches through the mountain valley between her breasts. His hands followed the contours of her supple hips. "Do you ever wonder how we found each other, my love?" he said, serious all of a sudden, yet still kissing and moving down between her thighs. "Not at the moment," she huffed into a pillow of fine hemp fabric. Chuckling, he threw her toned legs over his work-hardened shoulders. Lasoni's body tingled with magic and mounting tension as he kissed her warm mound, sucking and licking where she had taught him. Fingers tangled in his thick hair. She used Thoreau's mouth like a grinding stone, crushing her clit against his slow, firm tongue circles. Her abs tightened, and she lost herself in shuddering orgasmic waves. Arching her back, Lasoni sent the sparrows on the roof flying with ecstatic screams. Afterwards, they lay intertwined. She set aside any worries that might ruin the moment. Just as she was about to drift off to sleep, Thoreau let out one of his little snores, and she laughed into her hand, wanting to smack him in jest. Instead, she pulled his arm tighter over her waist. Interlocking her shorter, thicker fingers in his long, slender ones, Lasoni thanked the great mystery for times like these. No matter how far she journeyed, inward or out, nothing compared to Thoreau's touch and unwavering devotion in a world that demanded neither from him. Lasoni tried to hold on to that comforting sentiment as her eyes closed, knowing that hard times were always waiting just outside their door, but for now they were safe.